All right, let's get things rolling. Enjoy. My guest today is Dr. Richard Maurer, author of The Blood Code, Unlock the Secrets of Your Metabolism, and naturopathic doctor who's been practicing integrative medicine for over 2 decades. Rich, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Mark, it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Well, listen, can we maybe kick things off here by giving listeners maybe a quick background of how you got interested in naturopathic medicine?
It's always a fun little walk through memory lane for me. Sure. I was actually in music school in Philadelphia, and for fun, I was reading textbooks on nutrition and ultimately natural medicine, thinking this was a common practice. I was reading the books of Carl Pfeiffer, the Mind Body Institute in Princeton, New Jersey. Fascinating questions they were asking, which was essentially, what are the nutritional therapies that can help people with really complex chronic problems? It forced me into the question of what is a healthy diet. I've been practicing that on myself. I've been practicing that on patients for 24 years, and it turns out I've changed the question. So I went to naturopathic medical school out in Portland, Oregon, back in the late 80s, finished in the early 90s. And I still ask the question, what is a healthy diet, for the first 10 years of my practice, before really getting the question honed towards how is any particular diet affecting the person in front of me. And still, I walk my own talk as much as humanly possible. So I didn't write a book. My first book I did write, I ended up putting it in a drawer somewhere. I had great advice years ago. Write your first book, put it in a drawer, and then start on your second book. And after you're done, publish your second book, and then reach in that drawer, pull out your first book. And lo and behold, I realized the first book was kind of irrelevant. But it did make it so that I never actually published my first book. I published my second one, technically, which was great. My first book was called A Diet. It was called The Fatback Diet. I thought it was quite clever. I'm glad I never published it, because there isn't a diet that's going to be unanswered. So obviously the second book was the better question in my mind, which is, how do you test whether what you're doing is working for you or not? And then how do you tweak it so that you can better perform and live a better life?
Absolutely. And it's great to talk about individualization and personalization. And as you mentioned there, just who's in front of me, what is the best diet for them. So if we kick things off here to talk about, lab tests for assessing health and longevity and perhaps the best diet, can we start with, defining HOMA-IR and what it's measuring in folks?
Sure. So this is, the Blood Code is the name of the book. Thebloodcode.com has some of those calculators. So as soon as people go there, and in fact, right now I know that those calculators are getting hit, sometimes 50 to 100 times a day. And it's two simple calculators. One is that triglyceride HDL ratio, which is nothing more than a ratio, right? If someone has a triglyceride of 100 and a HDL of 50, that's a 2-to-1 ratio. So their triglyceride HDL is 2. The slightly more complex calculator is that HOMA-IR. HOMA is not very important for most people. That's the method that the test is done. But the IR refers to insulin resistance, right? And that's the calculation to quantify insulin resistance. The reason this calculator is helpful is to find those people who have wonderful glucose control because their pancreas is in overdrive. Right, they're producing very high insulin, and conventional medicine every conventional practitioner is using the type 2 diabetes and prediabetes metrics. Their only metric is glucose. Right, they're fixated on hyperglycemia being the definition for when type 2 becomes an issue. But many people are, I'd say of all the type 2s, about 40% of them are hyperinsulinemic. They produce a lot of insulin to help them get their glucose in check. Yes. So these are people who are putting on abdominal body fat. They're people who have high liver enzymes because they have excess liver in their excess fat in their liver, right? That high triglyceride will be in their blood profiles. They'll have a low HDL because the liver's congested in its normal function, presumably because of the fatty liver disease. So they're being blamed by their doctor for putting on weight, putting on abdominal body fat, and if they don't watch it, they're going to get pre-diabetic. The fact is, they're already essentially pre-diabetic, even though their fasting blood sugar is a perfect 88. But their insulin is going to be 12, 14, 16. It's going to be well above 10. So that high insulin, if you run it in the calculator, insulin times glucose divided by 405 gives us this number. The goal is to have it as close to 1 as possible. Fit athletes are generally going to be less than 1. You know, so many people in that primal paleo community. And when you're really restricting that carbohydrate intake, we expect those baseline insulin levels to be quite low. 2, 3, 4, 5 are not uncommon insulin levels on a fasting blood test. And this is I'm using this in U.S. terms. I know you're in Toronto right now, right?
Yeah, in Canada, obviously, England as well, and we can do we'll use a link as well for the conversion for the international units for folks. So don't worry about that.
Very good, and of course at the Blood Code I do have some of those conversion links. But what we're talking about here, when I say, let me do a quick, it's generally that times 6, right? So an insulin of 3, when I say that's kind of the lower side of healthful insulin, that's an 18 picomole per liter.
Perfect.
Right. So my systemic internationals, I generally want to see it below 50 in the international units.
Of course, a great early marker as well to kind of see when these trends are moving in that direction. And when you refer to getting these measures done, is this going to be in the fasted state then for folks if they're going to get this test run?
Yes. Years ago, I used to do the glucola drink. They drink 75 grams of sugar in a straight, I think it was only orange flavored at the lab. And then they would sit down, be passive for 2 hours, and I would have a 1 hour glucose and insulin and a 2 hour glucose and insulin. And I was being quite thorough in my testing. After about 5-10 years of doing that, I never really caught anyone that I wouldn't have caught with just the fasting test and the A1C. So if I run a fasting hemoglobin A1c, which is irrelevant of fasting, a fasting glucose, and then a fasting insulin, I can see the trend towards sugar, and I didn't need that postprandial challenge.
Yeah, that's great. So make it easier for folks to get it tested. Compliance goes up, all that kind of good stuff, right?
It was exactly it. The compliance to sit there, and many people who are already moving towards avoiding sugars, I started realizing, why am I testing them with a 75-gram sugar bomb?
For sure. They already struggle with it. So
they're already struggling with it. So then I was using 50-gram meals, using kind of bread or rice as the gram load. And it was getting just so complicated. The fasting test works 99.9% of the time.
Terrific. And so that
baseline.
And that fasting insulin, though, is often one that docs won't naturally be putting on that script for a physical. Often we do see the HA1C, so perhaps we can dovetail into that. But what would you suggest in terms of folks asking for that from their docs in terms of a fasting insulin, or going out and grabbing that from a lab?
Oh, great point to bring up for your listeners. Thank you, Mark. If there is one test that I recommend for people to request special from their primary care docs, it's the insulin. It's the one test that won't be on there, and it is the one test that is, I think, the most valuable at steering your diet, fitness, and kind of a good marker of longevity. Just a tremendously useful test. Even if someone had to pay for it, the cash labs, it's about $25. So, this is not a test that has a great reason not to be run, except that, at least in the U.S., our insurance follows kind of Medicare criteria. So insulin is not an approved test for virtually all diagnoses. So the doctor can't put a code down to justify the reimbursement for the order. So it usually gets denied. Therefore, they don't want to put it on an order because it doesn't just, the insurance won't just deny that one test. It'll deny the whole panel that they ordered.
For sure, for
So it
sure.
becomes a big, clumsy effort. If there's one way you can just plea with your doctor and say, is there some way you can try to order it? I'll pay for it, get it in there, get that in with your A1C, glucose, and lipid panel.
And if we
Put
dovetail that
those
into
things
the A1C there, Doc, can you discuss what the A1C is measuring and again, what kind of levels you're looking for?
Sure. The glycosylated hemoglobin, we call it the hemoglobin A1c. It's a calculation from that. We use the percentage in the U.S. So your U.S. listeners are going to be looking for anything below 5.7% as the non-pre-diabetic level. That is below 39 millimoles per mole, international units. So we generally want to see that in that lower range. It's pretty common to see the pre-diabetic pattern in someone. And this sometimes shows up when I'm first treating someone with a very low carb diet. Their insulin will drop and temporarily their sugars will go a little higher. This was actually my family effect. This was I'm from a family of thin diabetics. So we tend to not be the obese type. We tend to produce lower insulin, but we have body tissues that are insulin resistant. So we'll have low insulin hyperglycemia. So in my early 40s, when my hemoglobin A1c was up at about 6.1%, which is right in the middle of prediabetes. This is a number of, let's say 42, 43 millimoles per mole for international units. Enough where it opened my eyes. My mother was type 2 diabetic at 60 years old. So it was strong in my family, even on my father's side, it showed up. So I had to address it actually by building muscle mass. So when I saw that high blood sugar, but the low insulin, and my fasting blood sugars were just slightly high, they were just over 100 milligrams per deciliter. So my treatment was to correct my A1C, was actually to build more muscle mass, to work out not by running and biking. I had to give up my triathlon days and go to the weight room more.
For
I had
sure.
to change how
muscle's just that massive glucose sink, which is phenomenal for helping to correct some of that stuff.
That's it for whatever it was, my size, my genetics, my physical nature. I needed to balance my leanness by treating myself more like a bodybuilder, not like a long distance runner, even though I'm built like and from a family of marathoners. They're just not healthy, long-lived marathoners, which you and I might add that not many are.
It's a tough, the nature of the training, the volume so high, and of course the traditional practices are pretty carb heavy in terms of loading, which is tremendous, obviously on a race day. But I think, especially for recreational athletes, and in terms of the training nutrition, we know that we can do better these days with helping to maintain some of these markers, which you've talked about, the HOMA-IR, the HA1C.
Exactly.
Is there a range that you're looking for the HA1C to let you know that the diet's on point for your clients?
Yeah, so I see it in two ways. People with higher insulin are actually going to have lower A1Cs. So this is where that HOMA-IR comes in, is kind of helpful, right? So if you have high insulin, I'll very often see someone who's centrally obese with fatty liver disease and their A1C is at 5.2%. It's down around 31, 32 millimoles per mole. These are really well controlled, very non-diabetic patterns if you just look at the A1C. But then you'll see the fat's getting stored in the liver. The triglyceride HDL ratio is 3-to-1. They're carrying central obesity. If you're using skin fold calipers, you'll see that. If you're using body mass analyses, you'll see just a higher than optimal body fat percentage. So the A1C is sort of for the lean diabetics. As long as I get them to 5.7 or less, that's great. I tend to hover at 5.7, 5.8. So I'm actually in that 39 to 40 millimoles per mole. I'm borderline pre-diabetic, but for me, that's my zone. That works great for me. And the research really supports it's not like the lower the better. Watch out for the online jargon. We always fall into the trap of the lower the better. And someone's always going to print an article in some magazine saying, well, if prediabetes is this, let's not shoot for normal. Let's shoot for low normal.
For
And
sure.
I've seen
Very
some
well said. And great.
staggering how many times I've seen that A1C recommended online that we should be 5.2% or lower. To say everyone should be 32 millimoles or less is just crazy talk. There's no evidence to support longevity related to that whatsoever.
It's a great comment on the nuance of all this, and I'm glad you brought up also measuring the HOMA-IR as well, because obviously in traditional settings, just using that HA1C on its own is typically the practice, and assuming that we can get all the information we need from that one marker. So a great point there of just having more information to really be able to steer and make sense of the information. And of course, you mentioned there the triglyceride to HDL ratio. Can you walk folks through why that's important for assessing cardiovascular health?
Oh, very good. There is a tremendous volume of research showing that triglyceride HDL is a vastly better metric than LDL cholesterol for predicting who's going to have the next heart attack. It's a standalone risk factor, so it's not that it's related to cholesterol. It stands on its own. It's that triglyceride HDL. If I take it apart to define it, to me, it's the internal metabolic leanness that someone's carrying in their bloodstream, right? Their internal systems. We can look at body fat percentage analyses, and I use the low-tech skin fold calipers in my office. They're
Fantastic.
incredibly valuable because it doesn't only tell me the total body fat percentage, it also tells me where it is. So if someone's higher on their triceps, I might have them tone more. If someone's higher at their core, I'm going to have them lower their carb more. It helps me steer diet versus exercise emphasis. But getting that number, the triglyceride HDL should match it. If someone's carrying high central obesity, I'll probably see a triglyceride above 100, 100 milligrams per deciliter. It's that lack of synchrony that I'm often looking for. If someone's walking around lean, but their triglyceride HDL is a 3-to-1 ratio, that's weird. And those of us in the diagnostic world as physicians, we love weird. It's like Sherlock Holmes, right? It's like finding
what's going
on volcanic.
Here?
It's like finding a volcanic rock where there's never been a volcano. You go, all right, this is going to lead somewhere. So we're looking for those skinny fat people, the people who are metabolically storing excess fats, but they're skinny. This is a whole lot of long distance endurance athletes. And more than that, I'm looking for more common is the people who are centrally obese. They're carrying a little too much body fat. And we're trying to hone how they can not only get lean on the outside, but how we can get them leaner on the inside. Again, they should be in synchrony in a healthy system. That triglyceride HDL, I tend to be, I tend to exercise pretty regularly, and I tend to be on a very low carbohydrate diet. So I'm carrying a 0.5 to 1 triglyceride HDL ratio. I should be in the lean end of the spectrum. And at 8% body fat, my internal systems and my circulation should be carrying that level of leanness as well. So that's the goal. It's really, for the clinicians out there, it's like, does it match the person you're looking at? Those blood tests, if not, scratch your head and play a little Sherlock Holmes and say, maybe you're eating too many carbs for you. Maybe maybe we're missing something, exercise wise, we're not getting this right. Maybe that person doesn't need the pre-workout smoothie. We're actually trying to get them more fat adapted, and we wanted them to do their workouts in a fasted state.
Absolutely. Or that 400 milligrams of caffeine as well in their pre-workout that they don't realize is actually in there. I often see that in athletes as well. Sorry to cut you off there, Doc, but when we shift back to the LDL cholesterol, is there a point at which, that would raise an alarm for you if it gets to a certain level, or is it, will that be picked up in the rest of the panel with the triglyceride HDL?
It's going to be picked up in the rest of the panel. I conveniently leave the LDL conversation out of the blood code, just because it's its own book, right? We could go to the the cholesterol myths. We can tackle probably 100 other podcasts that I've listened to where that cholesterol story is really addressed. I would point people towards Ivor Cummings. Just about anything he's written, a very new book they have out, podcasts he's on, if people want to learn more about the faults related to the LDL theories towards cause and effect to heart disease and cardiovascular disease. Total cholesterol, is if I just use that, there is a point, for U.S. numbers, the total cholesterol, if it's above 300 to 320 for men, men and women, that's going to be too high. Although I did see a woman just yesterday, her total cholesterol was 331. Her LDL, therefore, was above 200. Her HDL was almost 100. But more than that, this is where I put my diagnostic hat on, and I run LDL fractionation studies, LPA, apolipoprotein BA1 ratios. For your listeners that are familiar with some of those cardiolipid advanced tests, which
Yep.
I had her, she paid cash for this test. It was $140. So this test used to be $700 only 5 years ago. We have access to some really good diagnostic metrics. Every one of her findings was in the not just normal range, but in the optimal protected range. She had no inflammation. Her LDLs were big, fluffy, beach ball sized LDLs, just tremendously well protected. So for her, a 300 cholesterol is her genetic makeup. And she's been exercising, going low carb. She's following all the rules. She doesn't smoke. She gets enough sleep at night. Her numbers look fabulous. So for her, I'm even breaking my rule saying, well, if LDL goes above 180 to 200, that's a problem. Hers was over 200 and it still wasn't a problem.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Even the differences between men and women, and obviously cholesterol being so much more protective as they age. So great insights there from getting some biomarkers and individualizing that protocol. And of course, if we dovetail this over into some inflammatory markers, obviously inflammation upstream of insulin dysfunction, blood sugar dysfunction, are there certain inflammatory biomarkers, lab tests that you like to run and get some information on your clients?
That's interesting. When I did the blood code, my goal was to keep the progress panel under $100. So it was $92. And part of that was leaving out the C-reactive protein, which in the research really dovetailed with something as simple as the white blood cell count. So on a CBC, the white blood cell count should be between 4 and 6. It shouldn't be on the high side of normal. So when the lab gives normal levels for total white blood cell count, that number is kind of telling. The systemic international units are the same here. So usually it'll be 3 to 10 is normal. I want to see it generally less than 6. If someone's walking around with 7s and 8s and they're not sick, it gives me a sign that the immune system is on an inflammatory search. This will commonly happen within 12 hours of a hard workout from an athlete.
For sure.
The important thing is recovery. I have to remind every one of my, and I'm not just talking about athletes in the high pro sense. So for your listeners, us amateurs, athletic demand is all relative to the tone and fitness you're beginning with. So
Absolutely.
What many of us are doing, even in our local gyms, is at an athletic level for us. So even though we're not doing what the video might be showing or what someone else can do, it has the same level of challenge. So we actually need the same level of recovery. So, and I know
Great.
I should leave you to be saying this, Mark.
No, great point,
Um,
Doc, and that easily dovetails into my next area here. We're talking recovery, or even obviously with metabolism, but thyroid markers often used in assessing athletic recovery. But as we talk about this
yep.
idea of longevity and metabolism, where do some of those markers come into play?
Oh, we might be opening up a little Pandora's box, but I'm
Go
more
for
than
it.
willing to do this with you. And I know so many podcast listeners are at a high level of understanding. So, T4 T3 conversion slows down with athletic effort, sustained athletic effort. This is the wonder of the less than 20-minute workouts. You can work out pretty hard for 15, 18 minutes, and your T3 never drops. Your body never, even though you've heated up, your body never sees this as a threat to your capital, right? Your threat to your body. So
Yep.
the internal thermostat just doesn't turn down. We maintain a basal metabolic rate where we were. Soon as that's maintained over 20, 25 minutes, especially in warm environments, someone swimming in a warm pool is far more likely to have a thyroid reduction effect than someone in a cooler pool. And this has been copied in just about every environment that you could test. That T4, T3 shutdown will raise reverse T3. It'll lower free T3. And that will stay that way for up to easily 24 hours, where the basal metabolic rate is significantly slower after those hard workouts, sustained heating up workouts. We look at that as part of our metabolic recovery. So it's one of those signs that if once T3 bounces back, we're probably ready to do another workout, but not before then. Go ahead.
I was going to say, in terms of your general screen, then, if you're going to run a test on somebody, would you jump in with multiple tests there? Would you start with the TSH, or how does that look?
I do. I have the full gamut, even for my progress checks. So I run a TSH, free T4, free T3, and reverse T3. I love to see that because I'm looking for those amateur. I'm going to use the word under exercisers, excuse me. I'm usually looking for the over exercisers, but I'm going to rename that under recoverers. But that's hard to say.
Absolutely, yeah. It's amazing how, obviously we always, even the term overtraining is sort of misused even at the elite level of this idea of capacity to recover being so key. And of course, as you mentioned, the thyroid markers just being a great sense of that. And of course, people who have metabolic dysfunction, they're inducing a whole type of stress that's almost the equivalent to exercise from just being in poor health as well. And sometimes that can influence some of those markers as well. Can you speak to that client who's potentially, holding on to 20 or 30 pounds, abdominal adiposity, how that might impact some of those markers?
Oh, I don't know if I'm going to answer your question right. The insulin resistance, the reason I had one content editor early on when writing the blood code, and she said, I think you may need to take the thyroid stuff out of the book and make that a separate, that'll be, edition 3, make it a different book, get it out of there. So I took it out. I tried writing the blood code without talking about thyroid. And after about 6 weeks, I couldn't do it. I had to bring the thyroid. So I dovetailed it all back in. The reason is those people who have the hypothyroid trait are about twice as likely to have insulin resistance in their blood markers. So, and I think we'd have to talk more, ancestral vulnerabilities to understand that, right? The same environmental traits over the past 100,000 years has favored both of those traits. One is to burn less of your equity, and the other is to store more with what you do get. So one is save more, the other is spend less. So hypothyroid, you're going to be spending less with a slightly slower basal metabolic rate. So you're spending less at rest. Exercise is the great equalizer. At exercise, we're all burning the same, whether we come into it slightly hypothyroid or not. Once you're into it 20 minutes, you're all burning the same, given the same physical qualities. So the thyroid isn't, ironically, the thyroid itself isn't usually the driver. So when someone's carrying extra weight, 10 years ago, I was using a lot of thyroid hormone therapies to try and be an adjunct. If someone had slightly borderline hypothyroid, I'd be treating them. The fact is, I never saw it work. And I had my entire functional medicine community supporting that practice, and I actually think it's a failed practice. Our body is so good at deactivating thyroid that as we, as practitioners, try to increase thyroid dosing when the fundamental problem is either a dietary or nutritional, or perhaps not even a problem. It's the body doing its job, trying to preserve capital. We're trying to dose higher and higher thyroid, and the body's just increasing its deactivation.
Yeah, it's great point. Something that I see as well so much is just almost an overinterpretation of what's going on, and sort of the functional medicine or naturopathic side of some of these thyroid quote unquote conditions, or when a client comes in and says my thyroid is sluggish, or I think there's something wrong with my thyroid. And as you mentioned, when we get back to diet and sleep and stress management and getting the right training protocol going, all of a sudden thyroid markers can just sort of come back into line as we start to see patient success.
I've seen this over and over. T4, T3 levels, especially the T3 levels, bounce back up when I either adjust their fitness program to allow better recovery, or change their diet so that their body fat storage, I have to explain to them what's happening with that lower T3, that they're burning less calories, not all the time, but at rest. So they really aren't the people to be eating dessert. They're really not the people who need pre and post workout smoothies or meals. And that'll go against the stream of what they've heard in numerous other settings. So again, I use these biomarkers, I use these blood tests as a way of saying, this isn't my opinion against your nutritionist or your trainer or your functional medicine practitioner or someone who's given you nutritional advice. This is what's happening in your body. Let's work with it. And make those subtle adjustments.
Great stuff, Doc.
And I'll add, you mentioned the longevity. Lower T3 is associated with longevity. So we actually don't necessarily want to drive someone's T3. There is this sort of sense in the natural health community that we want to have higher thyroid function, like low function is all bad. Once you're, should any listener have reached the young age of 75, from 75 onward, you want your free T3 levels down at the 2.5 or less. These are the picograms per liter. This will be say what would it be in yours? 4.0 picomoles per liter, which sounds like a low free T3, but actually that's your target. It's totally good to have a low T3. It just means that you're probably going to feel sluggish, and you're probably going to put on weight easier if you don't exercise at all. So we have to introduce, as clinicians, the bad news that they need to exercise every day. They need to live an active life.
Yeah, it's amazing how movement is so key to a lot of things. If we get people moving and moving the right way, then we can fix a lot of things and a lot of dysfunctions, right?
That's right. We're probably doing it wrong when we sit our patients down in the office and then try to talk to them about their metabolism.
For sure. And any other tests then, Doc, in terms of the health and longevity front that we haven't chatted about that come up as high on your list in terms of things to monitor, get assessed?
Good question. While I do a number of advanced tests in my office, once for those patients I see and the 2.5 days a week I'm in consultations, in the blood code, I really stuck with low hanging fruit. When we talk about insulin, yes, of course, the 3 nutrients I'm running are the B12, ferritin, vitamin D, as part of the metabolic discovery panel. But insulin, A1c, glucose, triglyceride HDLs, that makes up the vast majority. And there's no reason for someone to be looking at some telomere-related enzyme for longevity until they've truly addressed these, 5 markers.
Yeah, those bigger buckets are so key, right?
They are such big buckets compared to some of the tests that are out there. So I don't use genetic testing, as the markers at this point. Whether someone's a slow metabolizer or fast metabolizer are very interesting when you're looking at P450 enzymes. And it's not that I wouldn't get valuable information from these some of these advanced genetic panels. It's so much more important to look at actually what's happening in the body, not what someone is vulnerable to have happen potentially.
Terrific. And if we circle back quickly, Doc, to some of those micronutrients that you mentioned, can you give us a brief summary of those 3 markers and what they're telling you?
Absolutely. The ferritin is the most important. And that's another, I tried to say it earlier, right? Insulin would be the most important test for someone to ask for. Should their doctor be ordering a panel, knowing that that's not going to be on there. The other test to request, especially if someone's never had it tested, is ferritin. Ferritin used to be called, back when I was in school, it was called the storage form of iron. But when you read ferritin, I don't know if you've done this recently, but I find myself in front of some of these metabolic research papers where ferritin is being referred to as a hormone, delivering muscle-to-muscle message, critical for recovery. So post-workout, we're seeing ferritin jumping between cells and sending messages, which puts it in the category of a hormone, not a storage form of a mineral. So having optimum ferritin, we've always known, is extremely important for athletes. We have ranges for women that are, say, 30 to 150. That's universal for international and U.S. units. So 30 to 150 is healthful for women, but we've known that women athletes perform better when they're at about 50 to 150. I'd say 3 out of 4 women I test for ferritin levels are low. And one of those 3 are going to be extraordinarily low. Like, it's been causing symptoms for the past 5-10 years of their life. Severe symptoms, not just leg cramps, calf cramps, which is very common as the first symptom of low ferritin, but insomnia, migraines, certainly fatigue. So people really need that ferritin levels up, that ferritin level higher. Because of the increased muscle mass, we expect higher levels for men, also because men don't lose blood. They don't have 35 years of menstruation. So there tends to be a higher storage of that iron. So men, normal is sort of 70 to 300 nanograms per mil. So 70 to 300 is my optimal range. Again, athletes, I might want them to be closer to 90 or 100 as the bottom.
Awesome. Awesome stuff. And great.
And
Go
I'm
ahead.
looking for rule out anyone that hasn't had this done. It's in different populations around the world. It's about 4 to 7% of any given population is carrying a genetic trait called hereditary hemochromatosis, where excess iron is stored. So part of running the ferritin at least once in our adult lives is to make sure we're not carrying too much. That ferritin is also, it can get up, if it's double normal, I might then run the genetic test. But if I see a type 2 diabetic that's got inflammation and high ferritin, often the first thing I'm going to do is get that lower carb intake, adjust their exercise. I'm going to try and correct the blood sugars and see if the ferritin goes down. I've had some people, I thought they have hereditary hemochromatosis. They correct their type 2 diabetic pattern, and next thing you know, their ferritin levels are perfectly normal. That ferritin was a marker of inflammation. The liver will release more of that ferritin molecule in the process of generating inflammation in the body.
Yeah, it's amazing how obviously an acute phase reactant, and as you mentioned, clients who are struggling with abdominal adiposity or high weight gain, glucose
Mhm.
dysfunction, we're going to see those ferritin levels really high. And of course, it's a key involvement in a lot of the signaling, as you mentioned. When there's so much noise in terms of that inflammation, it's that signal in terms of the exercise that also just doesn't come through as it should do. So as you mentioned, you get them on the right diet, get them moving, and all of a sudden we start to see that number come down. And of course, you mentioned kind of being in that sweet spot as well, but rather than folks just being, thinking that more is better, right?
That's right. And so it's ruling out for the low. It's the Goldilocks effect, right? We really want the bed that's just right. And that ferritin level is one of those markers. We don't want to be chronically inflamed, and we don't want inadequate recovery messaging.
Terrific. And on the vitamin B12 front, vitamin D, what are you looking for there?
Yeah, vitamin D. I'm going to bring that one up first because, again, there's a lot of misinformation noise out there. I use 30 to 60 nanograms per mil. That is equivalent to 75 to 150 nanomolars in the systemic, the international units. Mm-hmm. So 75 to 100, 30 to 60 in US. Years ago, there were some studies with various conditions like MS and a couple other neurological diseases where they looked at the bottom quintile or bottom decile and they compared it to the top decile and they said, wow, the bottom has far more MS onset, melanoma than the top decile. Therefore, let's shoot for everyone being in the top. It's a terrible way to interpret population data in retrospective studies. It doesn't work that way. So what happened was a lot of people in the functional medicine community said, all right, let's get your optimal range 80 to 100 nanograms per mil, which is telling everybody they should be well above 200 nanomolars per liter in vitamin D. That is just excessively high. I can't get people there without giving them near toxic levels of vitamin D. So 30 to 60 is good. Once someone's in that 30 or 75 nanomoles range, they're out of all the risk categories of conditions. I practice in Maine, and in our winter, we tend to get a lot of cloudy weather. It's a
being
dark,
from Canada.
low
It's the
sun.
same. It's the same deal from November to April.
So for me to stay even up in my healthful range, I need to take 1,000 to 2,000 units of vitamin D every day for about 6 months a year. And I did change. I used to do all my workouts in the morning. It did make me feel better. But I tended to then stay in my office for 8 to 10 hours for the day. I now take an exercise time between 11 and 12 in the morning. I get out there in the wintertime, right when the sun is out, and I'll go for a 1 mile run. I'll just get some exercise. So I think vitamin D is not just a vitamin. It's a pre-steroidal compound. Our body makes it. There's no other vitamin in existence that we do that with. So by definition, it's so poorly named by calling it vitamin D. So what we're measuring is actually this compound that our body. So we have to use vitamin D levels as proxy for our activity in the sunlight.
Very well said. And yeah, it's amazing how even vitamin D we're seeing almost as a marker of overall health because, as when we see that pattern of insulin dysfunction or pro-inflammation, all these things, and we start to see lower vitamin D levels. And of course, when those things are corrected, along with being out in the sun, it's amazing how things balance themselves out.
That's right. It sure does. And B12 levels, I'm really just looking for that healthful range. I use in the US ranges, I'm using 400 to 1400 as optimal. I'm going to be slow on the conversion of that right now, but it's just slightly higher than the reference range on the lab will usually be the point at which you're going to have neuropathy will be set as the bottom healthful range. So we have to lift that bottom range on almost every lab report. You have to lift that bottom range. Ours is around 200. I lift it up to about 400 because that's the range we don't see symptoms.
Terrific.
I'm not using too much vitamin B12. In fact, a small amount supplementally is usually enough to keep someone peaked. So even a good quality multi gets that B12 level where it should be, right in the middle of optimal. I don't think we'd be needing B12 if we were eating liver all once a week, or shooting oysters once a week.
Nice,
There are
absolutely.
ways of doing this, and boy, if any of the low carb people listening have had, Dominic, is it
D'Agostino, yeah.
Dom D'Agostino, he's just such a fan of eating those canned oysters. He'll pound through 2 or 3 cans of oysters at least in a week. Those are about as high in zinc and B12 and iron as you can get any food.
Yeah, amazing how
Great.
nutrient dense they are. And as you mentioned, supplementation obviously can be helpful for those who are maybe vegan, vegetarian clients or people that we know might be more at risk. But otherwise, yeah, some great food options there as well.
Absolutely.
Doc, I want to make respect your time here today. So, last couple questions for you. The first is the evolution of using some of these blood biomarkers for health. Where do you see that going in terms of whether it's tech or being able to access these point of care for clients? So, where do you see that evolution?
I think it's we still have in the U.S. 4 states that do not allow patients to get blood tests done directly for themselves. They have to go through the doctor. We did see part of about 3 years ago, our president signed a bill for the healthcare and Medicare adjustments, and it required all labs to have an obligation to release their results to the patient directly. So this is only 2-3 years ago where, the feds actually had to come in and say patients can be trusted with their own lab test results, as though there was something the doctor was in sole authority to make these interpretations. So that we still have several states that prevent patients from getting blood tests done directly. Granted, these people in New York State can drive across state lines and get their blood drawn elsewhere. So everyone's still getting it done. There are kits being sent in the mail. Clandestine organizations are pulling that off.
For sure.
And so I think the trend is to move more and more towards, public access to getting blood test results. It should be no different than walking into a store that has a blood pressure marker and you stick your arm in and you get your blood pressure done. You stand on a scale, you get your body fat percentage done. These things, blood test results are really that simple to me.
Terrific. Great stuff, Doc. And the last question for you here, the biggest take-home message for listeners on this health and longevity front, what would that be?
I'm still, I have a website out there that I've never launched, and I was questioning whether to do it, Longevity Me. And it was kind of okay, I'm going to promote this longevity game, but realizing that, I'm only in my early 50s. Like, I'm not old enough to write this tune. We're all,
for sure.
We're all fellow journeymen. And what I was absolutely convinced about 25 years ago is very different than what I'm promoting now. And I'm afraid that 25 years from now, I might be tweaking it a little bit. So I think on the health and longevity front, my recommendation is to always keep an open mind, use metrics to make sure what you are doing is in the right direction. And while we want to take in a lot of this information, it's not faith-based. We don't have to believe in the one thing. We have to measure and be open to tweaking over and over again. And if that means, the ultra low carb paleo diet isn't working for someone, great, bring some bread back in. I did that just yesterday with someone. She's had a fabulous success, but after 2-3 years in the diet and exercise, the way she was doing it, she was crashing. Just low energy, very low libido, and just gut was feeling all turned upside down. So we had to back away from what was very successful in the prior 5 years of her life and make big adjustments. And that has actually been working great. So and she looked at me saying, but that's impossible because this is working. And I had to say, well, true, but
dynamic thing, isn't it? So things
evolve,
and
you're not the same person, hitting 52 years old for a woman, you're going to expect that what you were doing 5, 10 years ago is probably not what you'll be doing for the next 5 to 10 years. So for a pearl for longevity, I'm usually going to say, the pearl is to pivot when needed, and use the measurements and use your guides and explore and experiment. And I think, people running podcasts, that would be you, Mark, are incredibly valuable for us all, because we can use this information to sort of make little adjustments in our lives and then hopefully make a measurement to see whether it was healthful or not and keep pivoting. So longevity, I think, is about plasticity and a work in motion. And I am yet a fellow traveler with your listeners.
Fantastic. That's tremendous insight there. I think that's a great tip for folks. And of course, all your great information here today, I think, can help a lot of people as well. So where can people stay connected with you and keep up with all your terrific work and research?
Great. I am at Facebook at Blood Code. Thebloodcode.com is usually the best way to get in touch. My email is connected there. I am on Twitter with infrequent posts, but they're present, and that is Dr. Richard Maurer.